Before anyone tells you this is a story about jealousy, understand this first: jealousy is loud, clumsy, easy to spot. What happened here was quieter. Colder. It moved like fog through rooms I thought were safe. By the time I realized what she wanted, it was already too late to protect it. She didn't want my boyfriend. She wanted my life. My voice. My place in the world. And the most terrifying part wasn't that she tried to take it. It was how easily people let her. At first, there was nothing dramatic. No screaming matches. No lipstick on collars. Just a strange, tightening feeling in my chest when she laughed the way I laughed, dressed the way I dressed, spoke my memories back to me like they were hers. I remember the smell of coffee in my kitchen one morning, the sound of her shoes on my floor, and the sudden thought that I was standing slightly out of frame in my own life. That's when fear arrived. Not the kind that makes you run, but the kind that makes you stay very still and hope you're wrong. This story isn't comfortable. It doesn't hand you a villain and ask you to clap when she falls. It asks harder questions about identity, emptiness, and what happens when someone decides that becoming you is easier than surviving as themselves. If you're drawn to stories that sit heavy in your chest and don't let go, take a moment now to like this video and subscribe. What comes next isn't easy to watch, but it's honest. Before she arrived, my life was unremarkable in the way that feels sacred only after it's gone. Days moved with a gentle predictability. Mornings smelled like toast and soap. Evenings settled into familiar silences beside someone who knew how I breathed when I slept. I didn't feel watched. I didn't feel measured. I existed without narrating myself, which is another way of saying I felt safe. When people talk about peace, they often imagine something dramatic, but peace is usually quiet. It's the absence of vigilance. It's not checking reflections twice. She entered that quiet space without force. No slammed doors. No sharp edges. She was introduced the way most intrusions are, wrapped in politeness and smiles. Someone's friend. Someone's coworker. Someone harmless. She had a soft voice and eyes that lingered just long enough to feel attentive, not invasive. The first thing I noticed was how carefully she listened. Not the distracted listening people do while waiting to speak, but something closer to cataloging. As if every sentence I offered was being stored away. At first, it felt flattering. When she laughed at my jokes, I felt briefly brighter. When she asked about my routines, my tastes, my history, I mistook her curiosity for kindness. We're taught to see attention as validation. We're taught that being noticed means being valued. So when she remembered small details, repeated my words back to me days later, mirrored my expressions unconsciously, I smiled and told myself I was being paranoid. People imitate those they admire. That's what I believed. That's what I wanted to believe. The imitation didn't arrive all at once. It crept. One afternoon, she wore a sweater almost identical to mine, the same dull green, the same frayed cuff. She laughed it off when I noticed, said she must have been influenced. Another day, she ordered my usual drink without asking what it was called. Another time, she finished a sentence for me, word for word, and then flushed as if embarrassed by coincidence. Each moment alone meant nothing. Together, they formed a rhythm I couldn't quite name. I remember the first time discomfort outweighed politeness. We were sitting together, the low hum of conversation around us, and she began telling a story from my childhood as if it were hers. Not maliciously. Casually. She caught herself halfway through, corrected a detail, laughed it off. Everyone else laughed too. I did not. Something inside me recoiled, sharp and sudden. It felt like watching someone step into your home and rearrange the furniture without asking, then act surprised when you notice. After that, I became aware of her in ways I hadn't before. The sound of her voice echoing my cadence. The way she angled her body the same way I did when listening. the expressions she wore that had once felt uniquely mine. It was like watching my reflection learn to move independently. I started to feel a low-grade unease, a constant hum beneath my thoughts. I'd catch myself adjusting my behavior, wondering if I was still the original or just another version. She never crossed a line that could be named. That was the cruelty of it. There was nothing to confront, nothing to accuse. Only the sense that I was being slowly traced, outlined, absorbed. When she spoke to my boyfriend, her tone softened into something intimate, familiar, as if she were borrowing my emotional language. I noticed the way he responded, not with attraction, but with recognition. That hurt more than jealousy ever could. Recognition means replacement is possible. At night, I lay awake replaying moments, asking myself if I was inventing the threat. Maybe I was self-centered. Maybe I was afraid of being ordinary, and she was just similar to me. But the fear didn't fade. It sharpened. I began to realize that admiration, when stripped of boundaries, can become consumption. And I was beginning to feel consumed. The most unsettling part was how invisible my discomfort felt. To everyone else, she was warm, earnest, trying to belong. To acknowledge my fear would have made me look cruel, territorial, dramatic. So I stayed silent. I smiled. I watched. And somewhere in that silence, the first real loss occurred. Not of my relationship. Not of my status. But of my certainty that I was still fully myself. The silence I chose became a kind of accomplice. Once I decided not to speak, not to draw attention to the wrongness of it, everything intensified. I started noticing her absence as much as her presence. When she wasn't around, there was a strange relief, quickly followed by a fear that she was elsewhere, practicing. Becoming. It sounds absurd when said plainly, but that's how it felt. As if identity were a skill she was refining, a role she was auditioning for, and I was unknowingly supplying the script. I began to sense her anticipation before I spoke. The way her eyes lifted, her posture subtly aligned, ready to receive and replicate. It was unsettling, like watching someone mouth your words half a second before you say them. Conversation stopped feeling spontaneous. I caught myself pausing, rerouting sentences, changing opinions mid-thought just to see if she would follow. She always did. That was when fear hardened into something heavier. Something lonelier. Smell became a trigger. The perfume I'd worn for years, something faint and woody, appeared on her coat one afternoon. She said she'd bought it on a whim, that it reminded her of comfort. I nodded, my throat tight. Sound became another. The way she cleared her throat before speaking, the cadence of her sighs, the laughter that now landed with my timing, not hers. It was as if she were learning me the way actors learn accents, practicing until the seams disappeared. I started questioning my own authenticity. That was the most insidious damage. When someone mirrors you too closely, you begin to feel duplicated, diluted. I wondered if my gestures were ever mine to begin with, or if I'd just been lucky to claim them first. I felt ridiculous thinking this way, yet unable to stop. I'd look at my hands and feel a strange distance, like they belonged to a shared resource rather than a singular body. There was a moment, small but decisive, that confirmed my dread. We were standing together in a crowded room, noise pressing in from all sides. Someone asked her a question meant for me. She answered without hesitation, with my story, my inflection, my practiced humor. No one corrected her. No one noticed. I stood there, smiling stiffly, feeling myself fade at the edges. It wasn't that she had taken my place. It was that my place had been offered so easily. After that, I began to withdraw, instinctively, the way animals do when they sense a predator they can't outrun. I spoke less. I laughed softer. I changed my routines, my clothes, my patterns, hoping distance would protect me. It didn't. She adjusted seamlessly, absorbing the changes as if they were updates. The realization landed hard. This wasn't about similarity. This was about proximity. She didn't want to be like me in general. She wanted to be me specifically, in the spaces I occupied. My boyfriend noticed something was wrong, but not the thing itself. He asked if I was tired, stressed, imagining things. His concern was genuine, and that made it worse. I couldn't articulate the threat without sounding unstable. How do you explain that someone isn't trying to steal your partner, but your personhood? There's no language for that in polite conversation. So I told him I was fine. I told myself the same lie. At night, dread settled into my bones. I dreamed of mirrors that didn't reflect me, of voices calling my name from other mouths. I woke with my heart racing, the room unfamiliar, as if I'd been away too long. The fear wasn't of losing something external. It was of becoming redundant. Replaceable. Optional. I began to understand something then, something dark and clarifying. There are people who don't want what you have. They want the ease with which you exist. They want the coherence, the sense of self that feels unreachable to them. And when they find it in someone else, admiration curdles into fixation. I was no longer dealing with a person who liked me. I was dealing with someone who needed me to disappear, gently, without anyone noticing. And the tragedy was this: the more I tried to protect myself by shrinking, the easier I made her work. By stepping back, I gave her room to step forward. By doubting myself, I lent her my certainty. The first imitation had become something else entirely. A rehearsal for erasure. There was a particular afternoon I keep returning to, not because anything dramatic happened, but because it revealed the final shape of the danger. We were alone, the two of us, the space between our chairs narrow enough to feel intentional. The room smelled faintly of dust and old paper, the kind of smell that makes voices softer without anyone trying. She watched me with an expression I had once seen only on my own face when I was trying to understand myself. Not curiosity. Not admiration. Assessment. She asked me a question then, something deceptively simple about a choice I'd made years ago. When I answered, she nodded slowly, almost tenderly, and said, "That makes sense." I always felt the same way. The words landed wrong. Not because she disagreed, but because she didn't. Because she spoke as if the boundary between my reasoning and hers had never existed. As if we were interchangeable narrators of the same internal life. I felt a chill spread through me, sharp and unmistakable. In that moment, I understood that she wasn't copying me to get closer. She was copying me to replace the need for closeness altogether. If she could internalize me completely, she wouldn't have to risk rejection, or misunderstanding, or the work of becoming herself. She could simply step into a finished form. My form. I started to see the exhaustion beneath her precision. The way her eyes flickered when she thought no one was watching. The tightness in her jaw when conversations drifted away from familiar territory. There was a desperation there, carefully concealed. Not the desperation of desire, but of absence. As if something essential had never solidified inside her, and she was patching the gap with borrowed pieces. I might have felt compassion, if compassion hadn't required my consent. That realization complicated everything. It introduced guilt into my fear. How do you defend yourself against someone who is starving? How do you draw boundaries without becoming the monster in someone else's survival story? I began to wonder if my discomfort was selfish, if I was hoarding an identity that could be shared. The thought made me angry, then ashamed, then deeply tired. The final shift happened quietly. One day, I noticed she no longer looked at me as often. She didn't need to. She had memorized enough. Her attention turned outward, toward my life, my relationships, my spaces. She spoke with a confidence that hadn't been there before, moved with a familiarity that felt earned, not borrowed. That's when I realized imitation had given way to embodiment. She wasn't practicing anymore. She was performing. I felt myself becoming an observer, a witness to my own slow displacement. Friends responded to her warmth the way they once responded to mine. Conversations flowed around me without requiring my input. Nothing was hostile. Nothing was overt. And that was the most devastating part. There was no scene to make, no moment to point to and say, "Here, this is where I was taken from myself." I remember standing in a doorway one evening, listening to her laugh from the other room, hearing my own rhythms echo back at me through her voice. The sound made my stomach drop. It was then that I understood the true cost of my silence. By trying to be kind, by trying not to overreact, I had allowed something essential to slip its anchor. I had mistaken politeness for safety. I had mistaken empathy for protection. A sense of being less solid than before. The first imitation had done its work. It had taught me that identity isn't always stolen through force. Sometimes it's absorbed through proximity, through patience, through a hunger that knows how to wait. The change didn't announce itself. It never does. One day I simply realized that the air around her felt different, heavier, as if warmth had been replaced by something inert. Admiration has a temperature. When it's alive, it radiates outward, curious and open. When it dies, it becomes something else entirely. Observation without affection. Attention without warmth. I felt it before I understood it, a subtle chill that followed her into rooms. She stopped asking questions. That was the first sign. The hunger to learn had been replaced by certainty. She spoke less about discovering herself and more as if she had already arrived. When she did look at me, there was no longer curiosity there, but confirmation. As if she were checking her work against the source. It made my skin prickle. Being studied is one thing. Being audited is another. I noticed it most in silence. We would sit together, the space filled with ordinary noise, and I could feel her presence pressing in, not seeking connection but asserting it. The pauses between words stretched longer, thicker. I became acutely aware of my breathing, the sound of it suddenly too loud. I felt like an intruder in my own moments, like I was borrowing time that no longer belonged exclusively to me. My boyfriend began mentioning her more casually, her name sliding into conversation as if it had always been there. He'd reference something she said, a joke she made, an opinion that sounded eerily familiar. He wasn't betraying me. That was the cruelty of it. He was responding to something he recognized. To a version of me that had been carefully reconstructed and offered without the weight of history. Without the complications of being real. Jealousy would have been easier. Jealousy has a shape. It has rules. What I felt was more diffuse, more existential. It wasn't that she was taking my place. It was that she was making my presence unnecessary. I began to sense that if I vanished, nothing would collapse. The systems would adjust. Conversations would continue. My absence would be absorbed the way silence absorbs a stopped clock. I tried to assert myself in small ways. I spoke more decisively, reintroduced opinions I'd softened, laughed louder than felt natural. Each attempt felt performative, strained, like I was imitating myself. That irony wasn't lost on me. The more I tried to reclaim my identity, the more artificial it felt, as if authenticity had slipped beyond my reach and I was left with gestures. She noticed these shifts. Of course she did. But instead of retreating, she adapted. Her presence became smoother, less conspicuous. She didn't need to mirror me as closely anymore. She had learned which parts mattered. She leaned into those, letting the rest fade. Watching her was like watching someone compress a complex image into a clean, efficient symbol. All the messiness stripped away. All the humanity removed. There was a moment, sharp and humiliating, when I realized people found her easier to be around. She listened without needing anything back. She reflected without distortion. She agreed without resistance. In contrast, I felt heavy, complicated, difficult. I carried memories, contradictions, moods. I required effort. She did not. And in a world that rewards smoothness, that difference mattered. The coldness set in then, fully. Not hostility, not cruelty. Indifference. She no longer needed me emotionally, only structurally. I was a reference point, not a person. And I felt it in the way she interrupted me gently, the way she finished thoughts I hadn't voiced, the way she smiled when others responded to her with familiarity that had once been reserved for me. At night, my thoughts turned dark. I wondered if identity was ever truly owned, or if it was always provisional, lent by context and withdrawn when something more convenient appeared. I wondered how many people I knew were only themselves because no one else had bothered to replace them yet. The fear was no longer about her. It was about how fragile the self really is. I began to pull inward, conserving what little felt undeniably mine. My inner life grew quieter, more guarded. I stopped sharing dreams, stopped offering pieces that could be replicated. But withholding has a cost. Isolation crept in, slow and suffocating. I was protecting myself, but I was also disappearing. And somewhere in that withdrawal, admiration finished its transformation. What had once felt like attention now felt like surveillance. What had once felt like connection now felt like control. The cold had settled in. And I knew, with a clarity that made my stomach knot, that this was only the beginning. I began to notice how often my name went unsaid. Not avoided, just unnecessary. Conversations would arc around me, skim past my presence, and land comfortably with her. When people addressed us both, their eyes lingered on her a fraction longer, as if confirming something. As if she had become the clearer signal. It was subtle enough to deny, deniable enough to make me doubt my own perception. That doubt became a second skin. She had perfected something I hadn't realized was fragile, approachability. Where I hesitated, she moved forward. Where I questioned, she affirmed. She had learned not just how I spoke, but when silence made people lean in, when agreement felt like intimacy, when certainty felt like strength. Watching her operate was like watching a machine tuned for human connection. Efficient. Polished. Empty of friction. I felt clumsy beside her, like a draft compared to a final copy. The tension reached a quiet peak one evening when the three of us sat together, the room dim, the conversation light. My boyfriend told a story about us, something shared, something that belonged to the two of us alone. Before I could respond, she laughed softly and added a detail I had once told her in confidence. He smiled, nodded, accepted it without question. The story shifted shape, no longer ours, no longer mine. I felt something inside me give way, a small internal collapse that made everything else feel suddenly distant. I didn't confront her. I didn't confront him. I sat there, smiling, my body present while my sense of self retreated somewhere safer. Confrontation would have required proof. It would have required language for something that lived between gestures and glances. I had none. So I endured. Endurance, I told myself, was maturity. I would rise above it. I would not compete for my own existence. But the cost of endurance is erosion. Each day, I felt less reactive, less expressive, less inclined to assert. Not because I didn't care, but because caring had begun to feel futile. She anticipated needs before I voiced them. She offered comfort before I noticed discomfort. She had learned the shortcuts to closeness and used them freely. Meanwhile, I was stuck with history, with nuance, with the burden of being real. I started to feel anger then, sharp and disorienting. Not just toward her, but toward everyone who responded so easily. Toward myself, for failing to protect what felt so essential. The anger had nowhere to go. It simmered beneath my skin, manifesting as headaches, as clenched jaws, as the constant urge to escape rooms where I felt interchangeable. I wondered if this was how people vanished without leaving, not through loss but through redundancy. One night, unable to sleep, I stood in the bathroom staring at my reflection. The face looking back at me felt unfamiliar, not because it had changed, but because it no longer felt singular. I imagined her wearing my expressions, my posture, my emotional shorthand, and the image made my chest tighten. I realized then that what frightened me most wasn't losing my boyfriend, or my friends, or my place. It was losing the sense that my inner life was anchored to my body alone. There was a moment of clarity, brutal and clean. She didn't hate me. She didn't envy me in the way people imagine envy. She simply didn't see me as necessary anymore. I was a draft she had edited past. The admiration that once warmed her gaze had cooled into something utilitarian. She had extracted what she needed. The rest was surplus. That understanding hollowed me out. It stripped the situation of drama and left only truth. This wasn't a rivalry. It was a displacement. And displacement doesn't require malice, only efficiency. The world, I realized, doesn't protect originals. It rewards versions that are easier to consume. By the end of that chapter of my life, I felt suspended between selves. Too present to disappear completely. Too diminished to feel whole. The cold had settled deep, not just around her, but inside me. And I knew, with a certainty that made my hands tremble, that the suffering was about to become personal in a way I could no longer absorb quietly. The suffering didn't arrive as a single blow. It accumulated. It lived in the way my body reacted before my mind could intervene. A tightening in my chest when her name was mentioned. A dull ache behind my eyes when I heard my own phrases spoken in her voice. My nervous system had recognized the threat long before I allowed myself to. I was grieving something that hadn't officially been taken, and that ambiguity made the grief corrosive. My relationship began to change in ways that were impossible to chart but impossible to ignore. My boyfriend didn't love me less. That was the most painful part. He loved me the same way he always had, but the shape of that love had shifted. It was no longer a place of refuge. It had become a site of comparison, though he never meant it to be. He would say things like, "You and her think so similarly," or, "She reminds me of you." He thought these were compliments. I heard them as forecasts. I started monitoring myself around him, editing my reactions, suppressing irritations, exaggerating warmth. I wanted to feel irreplaceable again, and instead I became strategic. Love became labor. Intimacy became performance. At night, lying beside him, I felt the space between our bodies widen even when we were touching. I wondered if he noticed the difference, or if he simply felt that something had gone quiet and assumed it would pass. Sleep stopped being restorative. I woke with the taste of anxiety in my mouth, my jaw sore from clenching. Dreams repeated themselves in fragments. I would speak and no sound would come out. I would reach for something only to find her hand already there. I would watch people smile at a face that wasn't mine, then realize too late that it was. Waking offered little relief. The dread lingered, low and constant. The worst moments were the ones where I questioned myself. When I wondered if I was being cruel, possessive, ungenerous. When I entertained the possibility that my identity wasn't as distinct as I believed, that maybe I was clinging to something that was never exclusively mine. Those thoughts hollowed me out faster than fear ever could. They made me complicit in my own erasure. I tried, briefly, to explain. One evening, my voice shaking despite my efforts to steady it, I told my boyfriend that something felt wrong, that I felt displaced. He listened carefully, his brow furrowed, his concern genuine. Then he said gently that I might be overthinking, that she admired me, that I should take it as a compliment. His words landed like a door closing. Not because he didn't care, but because the framework he offered had no room for my experience. After that, I stopped trying to articulate it. I withdrew emotionally, not out of spite, but out of self-preservation. If I couldn't be understood, I would at least be intact. But withdrawal has consequences. Distance invites misinterpretation. My quiet became a problem to be solved. Her presence, by contrast, felt like ease. She filled the spaces I vacated without effort, without resistance. Watching that happen was like watching someone slip into your seat while you stand just a few steps away. I felt anger then, raw and unfiltered. Anger at her, yes, but also at him, at myself, at the world that had no vocabulary for this kind of harm. The anger scared me. It didn't feel righteous. It felt desperate. I worried that if I expressed it, I would become the villain, the unstable one, the jealous girlfriend people whisper about. So I swallowed it. The bitterness settled somewhere deep, heavy and unresolved. There was a night when the realization finally crystallized. We had argued, not about her, but about distance, about feeling disconnected. He said he missed how things used to be. I wanted to scream that she was standing right there in the middle of us, unseen and unnamed. Instead, I nodded. I apologized. And in that moment, I felt something break cleanly inside me. A line I could not redraw. I understood then that this wasn't just about someone else wanting to be me. It was about what that wanting had cost me. My sense of safety. My ability to trust my own perceptions. My ease within love. The suffering was no longer theoretical. It had reshaped my inner life, leaving scars no one else could see. And the tragedy was this: even now, even as I felt myself thinning, I still couldn't bring myself to hate her. Because hatred would have required certainty. And certainty was the one thing this experience had taken from me entirely. The days that followed felt suspended, as if time itself had lost momentum. I went through motions with a strange detachment, completing tasks, answering questions, laughing at the right moments, all while feeling as though I were slightly misaligned with my own body. The world looked the same, sounded the same, but I no longer trusted my footing in it. Every interaction felt provisional, as if it could be rewritten without me. What hurt most was how alone the suffering was. There were no visible wounds, no events dramatic enough to justify the depth of my pain. From the outside, I was simply quieter. More reserved. Inside, I was dismantling myself piece by piece, trying to locate what was still undeniably mine. I stopped sharing thoughts that felt fragile. I guarded memories like they were evidence. I became careful with language, afraid that any sentence I offered could be lifted, repurposed, improved upon. I noticed how exhaustion crept into everything. Not physical exhaustion, but something deeper, heavier. The kind that makes joy feel expensive. I didn't have the energy to assert myself anymore, to correct, to reclaim. When she spoke in ways that echoed me, I flinched internally and let it pass. When my boyfriend smiled at her familiarity, I looked away. Avoidance became a survival tactic. If I didn't look directly at what was happening, maybe it couldn't fully erase me. But avoidance has its own cruelty. It teaches you to abandon yourself first. I began to feel resentment toward my own silence, toward the way I had allowed the narrative to progress without objection. Yet every time I imagined speaking up, I saw the disbelief on their faces, the gentle dismissal, the reframing of my pain as insecurity. I couldn't bear that second erasure, the one where your suffering is acknowledged only to be minimized. There was a moment, small and unremarkable to anyone else, that sealed it. She referred to a future plan using "we," and no one questioned who she meant. Not me. Not him. The word hovered in the air, heavy and final. In that instant, I understood that my presence had become optional. That the structure of my life no longer required me to be central to it. The realization didn't come with panic. It came with a profound, aching sadness. That was the personal cost. Not the loss of a relationship, though that was coming. Not the loss of status or affection. But the loss of my unquestioned right to occupy my own place. I had been displaced quietly, politely, without ceremony. And the worst part was knowing that no one involved believed they had done anything wrong. In that quiet devastation, in the understanding that harm doesn't always announce itself as cruelty. Sometimes it arrives dressed as admiration, as helpfulness, as ease. Sometimes it takes everything from you without ever raising its voice. Distance has a way of changing the shape of memory. Once I was no longer at the center of the story, I could finally see its edges. This phase doesn't begin with confrontation or escape. It begins with perspective. With the unsettling realization that clarity doesn't always bring comfort. Sometimes it only complicates the blame. I started noticing her when no one else was around. Not performing. Not mirroring. Just existing in the quiet aftermath of interaction. There was a hollowness there I hadn't allowed myself to see before. Her posture would slacken. Her expression would lose its polish. In those moments, she looked smaller. Not weaker. Just unfinished. Like someone who had learned how to hold a shape but not how to fill it. I began to wonder what kind of life produces that kind of hunger. What kind of absence makes another person's coherence feel like salvation? It didn't excuse what she had done, but it complicated it. I saw how carefully she curated herself, how tightly she held on to the borrowed pieces, as if letting go would mean dissolving entirely. The thought unsettled me more than anger ever had. Because it suggested that this wasn't malice. It was survival, misdirected and consuming. Once that idea took root, it refused to leave. I thought about the way she listened, not just to me, but to everyone. The way she collected traits, emotional shortcuts, relational strategies. I realized then that I hadn't been singled out because I was special. I had been singled out because I was stable. Because my sense of self had weight, history, continuity. To someone without that, it must have looked like shelter. That understanding shifted something inside me. It didn't restore what I had lost, but it changed how I carried it. My fear softened into something more ambiguous. Pity, maybe. Or grief for a life that had learned to substitute instead of grow. I began to ask myself harder questions. If identity can be borrowed this convincingly, how much of who we are is truly self-made? How much of it is assembled from what we're given, what we witness, what we cling to when we're afraid? The mirror cracked there, not cleanly, but messily. I could no longer tell a simple story where I was innocent and she was cruel. I had been passive. I had chosen silence. I had protected my politeness at the expense of my boundaries. And she had exploited that, yes, but she had also been invited in by it. That realization hurt. Responsibility, even partial, always does. I started to see the moral grayness everywhere. In my boyfriend's confusion. In my friend's easy acceptance. In the way systems favor what is smooth over what is true. No one had set out to erase me. They had simply gravitated toward what required less effort, less tension, less depth. She offered a version of me without the history, without the vulnerability, without the need for reciprocity. In a world exhausted by complexity, that version was appealing. That didn't make it right. But it made it understandable. And understanding is dangerous, because it tempts forgiveness before accountability. I felt myself slipping toward that edge, toward minimizing my own pain in order to make sense of hers. I had to stop myself. Empathy without boundaries is just self-abandonment with better language. Still, I couldn't unsee what I had seen. I couldn't return to a narrative where she was simply a thief. She was a mirror held too close, reflecting back not just my image, but the fragility of having one at all. She forced me to confront an uncomfortable truth: identity is not protected by intention alone. It requires defense. It requires articulation. It requires the willingness to be misunderstood. By the end of this phase, the story had outgrown me. It was no longer just about what she had done, or what I had lost. It was about the structures that allowed it to happen. About how easily presence can be transferred when no one insists on origin. About how thin the line is between admiration and annihilation. The mirror had cracked. And through that fracture, I could see not just her face, but my own, distorted, doubled, and asking a question I wasn't ready to answer yet. If no one owns who they are, what does it mean to lose yourself? The longer I sat with that question, the more it unsettled me. Identity, I realized, isn't just something you possess. It's something other people agree to recognize. That recognition had shifted, quietly, without ceremony, and the realization filled me with a slow, sinking dread. If who you are depends partly on who reflects you back, then the theft hadn't happened in isolation. It had been facilitated. Allowed. Normalized. I began to replay earlier moments with new eyes. The way friends leaned toward her ease. The way discomfort was smoothed over in the name of harmony. The way my silence had been interpreted as consent. No one wanted conflict. No one wanted to interrogate something that appeared benign. And so the easier narrative won. The one where nothing was wrong. The one where my unease was just an emotional weather pattern that would pass. What frightened me wasn't just how easily I'd been displaced, but how reasonable it all looked from the outside. There was no villain twirling intent. No dramatic betrayal. Just a slow optimization of social energy. She fit more neatly into the spaces I once occupied because she had designed herself to do so. She asked less. She needed less. She complicated less. In doing that, she revealed something bleak about the environment we were all moving through. Depth had become a liability. Friction had become a flaw. I wondered then if this was happening everywhere, quietly, in lives that never named it. People sanding themselves down to survive. Borrowing what works. Discarding what doesn't. And those who remain textured, contradictory, unresolved, slowly finding themselves edged out. Not because they're unworthy, but because they're inefficient. The thought made my chest ache. It made the story feel larger than any one of us. And still, the moral weight refused to settle cleanly. I could see how desperate she had been to anchor herself. I could see how tempting it must have been to slip into a ready-made coherence. But I could also see how destructive that act had been, not just to me, but to herself. Because borrowed identity is brittle. It requires constant reinforcement. Constant proximity to the source. The moment the source withdraws, the structure trembles. That realization gave me a strange, quiet resolve. Not anger. Not triumph. But clarity. I understood then that I couldn't reclaim what had been taken by force or exposure. I couldn't argue my way back into recognition. What I could do was refuse to continue participating in my own delusion. I could step away from the mirror entirely, even if it meant being unseen for a while. This phase of my life closes on that threshold. Not with justice. Not with repair. But with awareness. The mirror had cracked, and through it I could finally see the cost of pretending that admiration is always harmless, that identity is always shared generously, that silence is always kindness. Some reflections don't reveal who you are. They erase you by copying too well. Power is often imagined as something loud. Raised voices. Slammed doors. Clear winners and losers. What I learned instead was how quietly it can operate when it doesn't need force. No one had threatened me. No one had demanded I step aside. And yet, step by step, my influence over my own life had been reduced. Not taken. Reallocated. Once I saw it that way, everything rearranged itself. Power wasn't in her obsession anymore. It was in her placement. She was closer to the center of things than I was. Closer to the shared spaces where decisions were made, where narratives formed, where belonging was quietly negotiated. And I had allowed that closeness by retreating, by mistaking restraint for dignity. In doing so, I surrendered leverage without ever realizing I'd had it. What disturbed me most was how clean the process had been. No manipulation I could point to. No lies I could expose. Just an intuitive understanding of social gravity. She knew where to stand, when to speak, when to soften. She understood that power doesn't always come from dominance. Sometimes it comes from availability. From being present without friction. From making yourself indispensable by being easy. I began to see how often people confuse comfort with trust. She made people comfortable. I made people think. That difference had once been valued. Now it was a liability. Watching this unfold forced me to confront an uncomfortable truth about myself. I had assumed that being authentic was enough. That depth would protect me. That people would sense what was real and gravitate toward it. I hadn't accounted for fatigue. For how tired everyone was. For how appealing it is, in a weary world, to choose what asks the least of you. There was no violence here, but there was harm. A slow, grinding harm that wore down my confidence, my voice, my position. It didn't bruise my body, but it reshaped my posture. I found myself speaking more tentatively, occupying less space, as if I were already anticipating dismissal. That anticipation became self-fulfilling. Power works best when it convinces you not to resist. I thought often about intent. About how everyone involved could plausibly claim innocence. She hadn't set out to destroy me. My boyfriend hadn't chosen her over me. My friends hadn't rejected me. And yet, the outcome was undeniable. I had been displaced. The absence of malice didn't undo the effect. It only made it harder to name. That was the moral trap. If no one is clearly at fault, then responsibility diffuses. It floats. It settles nowhere. And in that vacuum, the person who has already lost ground is least equipped to reclaim it. I understood then why systems of quiet harm persist. They rely on the politeness of those they erode. On the hope that if we endure long enough, fairness will restore itself without confrontation. But fairness doesn't arrive on its own. It has to be insisted upon. And insistence requires power of its own. By the time I recognized that, I had very little left to draw from. I wasn't angry enough to fight. I wasn't visible enough to be defended. I was simply there, peripheral, watching a version of my life continue without my full participation. The most unsettling realization came late one night, sitting alone, replaying everything with brutal honesty. If the roles had been reversed, would I have noticed what was happening? Or would I, too, have chosen ease over complexity? Would I have told myself a comforting story about admiration and coincidence? The answer frightened me. Because I wasn't sure. I lives in that discomfort. In the recognition that power doesn't always look like cruelty, and harm doesn't always announce itself as injustice. Sometimes it looks like adaptation. Like efficiency. Like someone else stepping into your shape because it fits the room better. And sometimes, the most dangerous thing about that power is how reasonable it appears while it's taking everything from you. Once I accepted that power had shifted without force, another truth surfaced, darker and harder to sit with. Power doesn't only belong to the one who advances. It also belongs to the one who retreats. I had believed withdrawal was a moral high ground, a way of refusing to participate in something corrosive. In reality, it had been interpreted as permission. Absence creates opportunity. Silence creates narrative space. And someone else will always step in to fill it. I began to notice how my presence had changed in rooms. People no longer checked for my reaction before continuing. Conversations didn't pause when I fell quiet. My opinions were received politely, then bypassed. None of it was hostile. That was the genius of it. Hostility provokes defense. Indifference simply proceeds. I was still there, but I was no longer consequential. Power had completed its work. What haunted me most was the realization that she hadn't needed to push me out. She had simply stayed. Stayed visible. Stayed agreeable. Stayed available. In contrast, I had grown careful, inward, less accessible. In a system that rewards constancy over depth, that was enough. She became a fixture. I became an option. I started to see how often power masquerades as harmlessness. How the person who takes up space gently is rarely questioned for doing so. She never demanded anything. She offered. And offering, I learned, can be more coercive than demand when it creates dependence. People began to rely on her emotional fluency, her readiness, her predictability. She became part of the infrastructure of the group. And infrastructure is invisible until it's removed. I imagined what would happen if she disappeared suddenly. Confusion. Discomfort. A noticeable absence. Then I imagined my own disappearance. A brief sadness. A few questions. And then adaptation. The thought hollowed me out. Not because I wanted to be indispensable, but because I had once believed I was irreplaceable simply by being myself. That belief had not survived contact with reality. There was anger in this realization, but it wasn't sharp anymore. It was heavy, inert, like something buried too deep to excavate easily. Anger requires belief in fairness. I no longer had that luxury. What I had instead was a growing understanding of how systems choose their favorites, and how often those choices have nothing to do with merit or truth. I began to wonder if what I experienced was less a personal tragedy and more a pattern. A quiet form of displacement that happens when authenticity meets exhaustion. When someone willing to simplify themselves outcompetes someone unwilling to flatten. The world doesn't always want depth. Sometimes it wants function. And function, I learned, can look an awful lot like identity when no one is paying close attention. I soon realized I no longer asked who was right. That question had lost its relevance. What mattered was what had happened, and how easily it had happened. Power had moved without announcing itself. Violence had never been necessary. All it took was proximity, patience, and a system ready to reward the path of least resistance. And somewhere in that understanding, another realization began to form. Power doesn't just displace. It eventually collapses under its own weight. Because what is taken without force must be maintained without rest. And I could already sense the strain beginning to show. The strain revealed itself in moments most people missed. A flicker of irritation when attention drifted away from her. A stiffness in her smile when conversations veered into unfamiliar emotional terrain. Power without violence demands constant calibration. It requires the person holding it to remain endlessly palatable, endlessly present, endlessly in tune. And that kind of vigilance leaves marks. I noticed how carefully she monitored reactions now. How often she checked faces after speaking, adjusting in real time. The ease she once embodied had hardened into something more controlled. She had become essential, yes, but also trapped by that necessity. If she stopped performing, even briefly, the structure she had built might wobble. Power that depends on proximity is fragile that way. It cannot rest. Watching this unfold stirred something complicated in me. Not satisfaction. Not vindication. Something closer to sorrow. Because I could see how far she had gone from whatever self she might have been building before she found me. She had won, in a sense, but the victory had no end point. There was no moment where she could relax and simply be. She had to keep becoming, endlessly, or risk disappearing. That realization loosened something in me. I stopped feeling like I needed to expose her, to reclaim territory, to correct the narrative. The power she held was already costing her more than it had ever cost me. She had bound herself to a shape that wasn't hers, and now she had to maintain it forever. I, at least, could step away. I understood that power without violence still exacts a toll. It drains both the displaced and the one who displaces. It corrodes quietly, leaving no obvious ruins, only lives that feel thinner than they should. The question was no longer who had taken what. It was what would happen when the structure could no longer sustain itself. Collapse rarely looks like the end of something. More often, it looks like a series of small malfunctions everyone agrees to ignore. A delay here. A misunderstanding there. The kind of fractures that don't alarm anyone until the weight finally shifts and there's nowhere left to stand. It began with exhaustion. Not mine. Hers. The vigilance that had once seemed effortless started to falter. She missed cues. Misjudged tone. Laughed half a second too late. These were minor things, barely perceptible, but I noticed them because I knew the machinery behind them. I had been the blueprint. I could see when the imitation stopped sinking. Others felt it too, though they couldn't name it. Conversations that once flowed began to stall. The warmth people associated with her thinned, replaced by something tighter, more brittle. She was still present, still central, but the ease that had made her indispensable was slipping. And without ease, proximity loses its power. The first real crack came when she tried to assert herself beyond the shape she had borrowed. She voiced a strong opinion, one that didn't echo anyone else's. The room reacted subtly, but decisively. A pause. A shift in posture. A few exchanged glances. It wasn't rejection, but it wasn't acceptance either. The message was clear, this version of her hadn't been rehearsed. It didn't fit the role people had agreed upon. I watched her recalibrate in real time, retreating back into safer territory. But something had already changed. Once people sense inconsistency, they begin to pull back. Trust, when built on predictability, is unforgiving that way. The structure she had built required constant maintenance, and now it was failing under its own complexity. My boyfriend was the last to notice. Or maybe he noticed and didn't want to admit it. The familiarity he had leaned into began to feel hollow. Conversations looped. Emotional exchanges felt scripted. He grew restless without understanding why. What he had mistaken for harmony revealed itself as repetition. And repetition, without depth, becomes unbearable over time. There was no dramatic breakup. No confrontation where truths were laid bare. Instead, there was drift. Missed calls. Shorter conversations. An unspoken sense that something wasn't aligning anymore. I was already on the periphery by then, watching the collapse like someone observing a storm from higher ground. I felt no triumph. Only a dull ache for everyone involved. The final unraveling came quietly. She withdrew, not all at once, but in increments. Skipped gatherings. Responded less. The structure that had once centered her adapted, as all systems do. New rhythms formed. New points of gravity emerged. The thing about displacement is that it never ends where it begins. Once motion starts, it keeps moving. I realized then that collapse doesn't restore what was lost. It doesn't rewind time or return stolen ground. It simply clears space. And space, I learned, can be as frightening as it is freeing. With her gone from the center, there was no automatic return to who I had been. That version of me no longer existed. I had been altered by the process, reshaped by vigilance, by doubt, by endurance. People asked how I felt about everything, cautiously, as if expecting relief. I didn't know how to answer. There was no clean resolution to offer them. No villain punished. No lesson neatly learned. Just the quiet understanding that what had happened couldn't be undone, only integrated. In the recognition that collapse is not justice. It is consequence. And consequences rarely favor anyone completely. The structure fell, but the damage remained, distributed unevenly among all of us. What mattered now was not what had broken, but what would grow in the space it left behind. After the collapse, there was a quiet no one talks about. Not the peaceful kind. The kind that hums. The kind that makes you acutely aware of your own breathing because there's nothing else left to listen to. The center had emptied, and without it, everything felt oddly weightless. Conversations continued. Lives moved forward. But the gravity that once held us in fixed positions was gone, and with it, the illusion that anything would snap back into place. I found myself alone in ways I hadn't expected. Not abandoned, but unanchored. The roles I had been pushed out of no longer existed in the same form. The self I had been defending had already changed, worn down and reshaped by the effort of surviving quietly. I wasn't returning to myself. I was meeting someone new. Someone thinner, yes, but also sharper. More aware of the cost of being seen, and the cost of being replaced. I thought about her often then. Not with resentment, not even with pity. With a strange, unsettled curiosity. What had she been trying to save? It couldn't have been my life alone. No one goes that far for envy. No one rebuilds themselves piece by piece out of admiration. What she wanted wasn't possession. It was escape. From incoherence. From emptiness. From whatever silence lived inside her before she found a voice that worked. And that was the hardest truth to hold. That her harm had not been born from hatred, but from need. From a terror of being undefined. From the belief that identity is something you acquire rather than something you endure. In trying to save herself, she had dismantled me. Not out of cruelty, but out of desperation. That didn't absolve her. But it complicated her beyond villainy. I asked myself where responsibility truly lived. With her, for crossing boundaries she never named? With me, for failing to draw them when it mattered? With the people around us, who chose comfort over clarity? The answer refused to settle anywhere cleanly. Responsibility, I realized, can be shared without being evenly felt. Some people walk away lighter. Others carry the weight long after the structure that caused it is gone. What stayed with me most was the fragility of recognition. How easily it can be transferred. How little protection authenticity actually has in a world that rewards smoothness, familiarity, and ease. I had believed that being real was enough. That coherence was self-defending. I know better now. Identity isn't just something you are. It's something you have to insist on, again and again, even when it makes rooms uncomfortable. In the end, there was no victory. No moral high ground that felt stable under my feet. Only a quieter understanding of power, and how subtly it moves through human relationships. Only a deeper respect for boundaries, not as walls, but as declarations. Only the knowledge that empathy, when unguarded, can become an invitation to be erased. I don't know what became of her. I don't know if she ever found a self that didn't require proximity to someone else's. I hope she did. Not for her sake alone, but because the alternative is a life spent endlessly rehearsing, endlessly watching, endlessly becoming without ever arriving. That's not survival. That's exile in borrowed skin. As for me, I learned to occupy my space differently. More deliberately. Less apologetically. I learned that disappearance can happen without leaving, and that presence must sometimes be defended, not explained. I learned that silence is not always kindness, and that being misunderstood is sometimes the price of remaining intact. This story doesn't end with closure. It ends with a question that still lingers in me, and maybe now in you. When someone tries to become another person, when they hollow someone else out to fill themselves, who are they really trying to save? And if no one stops them, who pays the price? If you want to sit with that question a little longer, you already know what to do. The truth is, stories like this don't end when the people involved drift apart. They echo. They show up later, in the way you notice who takes up space in a room, in how carefully you guard your voice, in the quiet decisions you make about when to speak and when to stay silent. If this story unsettled you, if it made you rethink admiration, identity, or the cost of being easy to replace, then it's already doing its work. These are the kinds of stories that don't ask for agreement. They ask for honesty. They live in the gray space where blame is uncomfortable and certainty is fragile. And if you want more narratives like this, slow, human, unsettling in the right way, take a moment to like this video. It helps these stories reach the people who need to hear them. If you're not subscribed yet, subscribe now. This channel is for stories that linger, that refuse neat endings, that trust you to sit with discomfort instead of running from it. We'll be here again soon, in another quiet place, with another story that doesn't let go easily.